to our chairwoman for convening this important hearing. There is a daily trauma that we experience in my town, in my home, St. Louis. In my community, we have many municipal governments, and many have their own local government, their own local police force, their own local revenue stream. Each of these municipalities relies heavily on systems that incentivize raising revenue off of targeting people living in poverty, specifically Black people, through traffic stops that lead to fines and fees. It does not have to be this way. I personally know many exemplary public servants who serve in our St. Louis municipal governments who do not want it to be this way. But our federal, state, and local governments prioritizing funding for militarized policing and incarceration over fully funding social safety nets, that's what has led to a crisis in our local communities where harming us is not just accepted, but it's encouraged. In 2015, the Department of Justice found that St. Louis officials evaluated their performance on the amount of revenue they produced. So much so that in 2012, 13% of Ferguson's municipal budget was funded by fines and fees. And the city budgeted almost a quarter of its revenue from fines and fees in 2015. And let me just say, because we didn't know, so many of us in this community, we didn't know that this was a problem, that this is something that shouldn't have been happening. We were just used to it being the norm. That's a big part of the problem. Unsurprisingly, the DOJ also found that 93% of those arrested were Black, whereas only 67% of Ferguson's population is Black. Black drivers were also twice as likely as white drivers to be searched during traffic vehicle stops. The reality is that too many people live in endless cycles of punishment that are deeply linked to violent and traumatic encounters with police, the threat of going to jail, or having to spend money you don't have to pay exorbitant fees. Judge Foster, how does the imposition of fines and fees affect people's livelihoods, our country's economic growth, and public safety in our communities?
Thank you for the question. Let me start with your with public safety, because there has been some research done, and it's very important to emphasize we're all concerned about public safety and we're all concerned about crime. But what we know is that fines and fees can drive crime, and they have a dramatic impact on law enforcement's ability to fight crime. And let me just give you a couple of numbers. In a study that was done of cities that rely on fines and fees for some of their revenue, what the study authors found is that for every 1% increase in revenue that a city derived from fines and fees, a 1% increase in fine and fee revenue meant a 6.1% decrease in violent crime clearance rates, right? So we're not spending police resources on violent crime, we're spending police resources on raising revenue. Similarly, for every 1% increase in revenue that the city relies on from fines and fees, there was an 8.3% decrease in property crime clearance rates. So police are not solving property crimes, they're raising revenue from fines and fees. That's not good for anybody, and it's certainly not good for public safety. So that's an important point, and I think it's really critical that we understand that. As Professor Harris mentioned, we also know that people commit crimes to pay their fines and fees. I was a judge. It's rare that people admit to committing crimes. But in a study that was done of over 1,000 people who owed fines and fees, 38% admitted to committing a crime to pay their fines and fees. Now, that's just not helping our community's public safety.
It's not at all. But thank you, Judge Foster, for all of that information. I don't think a lot of people know that information that you just gave, those numbers. Fines and fees. What we do know, though, is that fines and fees seem to show up at every level of the system. That's what, a lot of people do know, that we look at fees for traffic and detention, phone calls from jail, commissary, fees for pretrial release. That's what we know. So thank you for that information. Now we need to do the work to make sure that we change this. Ms. Wu, from your testimony, I gather that there has been some substantial amount of reform on the state level. Can you just briefly tell us what policies or reforms the federal government should promote?
Yeah, absolutely. I mentioned some local reforms that we're seeing that I think are exciting. I think that there's experimentation happening on the local level that the federal government could play a role in supporting. So, for example, text message reminders, redesign of court forms. Most people don't know that they have options besides paying a full amount, which they do under the law in Texas. They have options for waiver, reduction, community service. Our community service law allows people to do self-improvement work as part of community service. So taking college classes and that kind of thing. So we really think that encouraging people on the front end to help resolve their debt could help take care of a lot of the problems that we're seeing on the back end. I think the federal government has a role to play in supporting that kind of experimentation that's actually pretty low cost and can, once it gets started, can kind of keep up without needing these additional grant funding over and over, as people have mentioned.
Thank you, and I yield back.